In our first video on culture, we were talking about different components of culture: technology, language, symbols, values, and norms. And I said that norms are the expected behaviors in a society. How you greet someone, how you dress, how you respond to people who are older, just expected behaviors. We're going to talk about how those norms get ingrained in all of us, because we really don't know that it's happening, but yet it does, because the vast majority of people in a society have the same norms. If most of society was a subculture or a counterculture, then they wouldn't be subcultures and countercultures. So let's see how we get norms ingrained in us. Hope you're excited. I'm excited. Let's get started. Now, there are going to be two different slides of terms for this particular lesson, so please make note of them. Again, we're talking about internalization. That's one of the concepts we'll be discussing. Also, cultural relativism, which we've touched on in a previous video, along with cultural diffusion and cultural lag. A lot of culture-based terms in today's video lessons. So let's get started. So, internalization of norms. There are two main ways that we learn about the expected behaviors in our society. The first one is called internalization, which basically means we're learning about the norms of society without knowing we're learning about it. It just gets ingrained in us. For instance, you learn how to greet someone just because you've watched people do it forever. You know when to laugh or smile. You know proper clothing attire. You didn't have to learn it. You didn't have to take a course on it. You didn't have to study it. You just did it. That's internalization. The second are sanctions. Now, sanctions are like training a pet. When you're trying to train, let's say, a dog, if you're trying to train them to sit and stay and lay down and everything, you're going to use two things to get them to be obedient: rewards and punishments. And unfortunately, society treats us like a pet to learn some of these expected behaviors. And that's what sanctions are. Rewards or punishments used to make you conform, man, to make you go with what everyone else is doing, man. Yeah, all right, trying to be a hippie there. Positive sanctions and negative sanctions. There are two ways that society will get us to conform to norms, and with rewards and with punishments. So a positive sanction is any kind of reward. So, for instance, you're working at a job and you're doing everything you're supposed to be doing. You work overtime. A positive sanction is a promotion. A negative sanction at that same job, if you're not following the expected behaviors of that job, you get fired. And so what society will do is they'll always use these threats or these rewards to keep us in line. For instance, money or tax breaks or rewards. Negative sanctions a lot of time are imprisonment or fines, things like that. Now, the important thing is the more important the norm, the more serious the negative sanction. One of the most important norms that we have is the right to life. People should have the right to live, actually, and live and breathe and have their hearts beating. And if you break that, if you commit murder, the negative sanction for that is either lifetime in prison or in some cases even capital punishment. Now, as well as positive and negative sanctions, there are also formal and informal sanctions. Let's talk about informal sanctions first. Let's say that you're at school, friends coming over to say hi, and he walks up to you and says, "Hey, how's it going?" And you just don't even make eye contact and keep walking. Now, they're going to attach a negative sanction to that because that was very rude, but they're not going to call the school and say, "Hey, suspend this person. Hey, give them detention. Hey, arrest this person." But you maybe not invite them to hang out for a while. Maybe it's going to hurt your friendship. Maybe you're going to be rude to them in response. That's an informal sanction. It's the little things that we do to keep everyone in line. Like the kid who never showers. Eventually, after no one hanging out with that kid, he realizes, I need to shower regularly so I don't stink. Now, formal sanctions are given by businesses, by governments, by law enforcement agencies to keep us in line. So it could be a reward or punishment, jail time, or a promotion. But formal sanctions are given by a school, a government, a workplace. Informal sanctions given by us. Now, how does society enforce these norms? We talked about sanctions, but society has to make sure that we're all following everything internally in our society, and we have to make sure there's no exterior forces trying to change our norms. And a lot of times, authority figures do that and try to enforce those norms with us. Now, the reason why it's so important for conformity in society, because if people are not following our norms, the social order is completely jeopardized. You could have riots, it creates instability within an economy of a community, or it could even disrupt the safety of a community if people aren't following the norms. It's very important to follow the norms. That's why there are very few subcultures and countercultures, and there's a very negative stigma attached to them in a lot of cases. Now, that's not saying things never change. Things do change. Norms are broken and new norms are created. But you have to understand, when that happens on a large scale, it's not in a bubble. It affects an entire society, and sometimes it then jumps into different societies as well. So the first thing that usually happens is people in a society recognize an issue. So let's talk about, for instance, the civil rights movement in the United States. People are realizing that African Americans and Mexican Americans, Asian Americans should not have separate facilities like bathrooms and restaurants, because you're being treated as second class. You're not given the same human rights. So there was a large-scale movement, a social movement, to try and change that. So, just by the way, a social movement is basically long-term, not short-term. I know that's tough because we like to have everything now. It's a long-term effort to either promote a social change or stop a social change. Now, in the civil rights movement, there is a social movement to get rid of segregation and equalize rights for minorities and white Americans, but there is also a social movement to stop that from happening. So while you're having a social movement, there could be two social movements about the same ideology, the same idea, that are conflicting with one another, and they always involve large groups of people. Now, once a social movement occurs and that change happens, like civil rights movement, that never stays in that society. What happens is things start to spread. Things start to diffuse. You learned about diffusion in science class. Spreading of cultural traits. Now, a lot of times diffusion occurs when societies are interacting more. You pick up the advantages of the societies that you're interacting with. Now, this especially applies to technology. You know, oh wow, what's that? A cell phone? You don't need a landline to talk to someone? I want one of those. Diffusion happens all the time. The more we interact, the more culture diffuses. And the one risk that's going on worldwide right now is globalization. Are we creating one massive culture, and is that necessarily a good thing? Now, as these changes occur, there's always going to be resistance. And there's three different kinds of resistance that are going to occur. Ethnocentrism, the idea of, well, my culture is better than yours, so I don't need to adopt anything. I don't want a social change. I like the way things are. Cultural lag. For instance, we find a lot of cultural lag in developing countries because you have the internet that's starting to reach these developing countries, but the knowledge and the things that people are learning about the internet in developing countries isn't matching up with some of the more traditional viewpoints of the rest of that society. So sometimes where one component of culture is completely changing, the others are staying the same, and that's going to be a hindrance to change. Also, a vested interest. Sometimes people in power or people from the old school don't want things to change because that's how they grew up and that's how they liked it, and they don't like change because change is scary, and so they are going to do things to stop that change. A lot of countries around the world are very resistant to gay rights because of, a lot of times, vested interest. But here's the important thing. Social changes constantly occur throughout society, but they always occur because of compromises. Sides that are for and sides that are against have to meet and eventually have to agree, all right, this is the change that's going to occur, and we're all now going to follow it. If that doesn't happen, then it's not a really successful movement, social movement in society. Well, hope you learned something you didn't know before. Thanks for watching.